Think about the words, phrases, images, assumptions, experiences, and expectations that come to you when you hear the word research. Maybe this word stirred up some thoughts and images of labs investigating a wide range of topics within hard sciences like chemistry and physics, or academics within social sciences like education who are developing theories and testing different approaches that they can publish on in a journal article. Well, what if I told you that we can break this mold? What if I told you that we can reject the notion that research in special education can only be done by professional researchers and have the outcomes of that research then used by practitioners? Well, we can use established methods from research in special education that are typically done by universities or think tanks and adapt them to be practical tools that help us understand what's working in our current practices, what's not working, and what influences the effectiveness of these challenges or problems in practice. So this entire semester is all about the ways that you and your colleagues can do this. It's called action research. So over the past decade, research in secondary transition has aimed at better supporting practitioners in the field by investigating and substantiating the impacts of a broad range of practices. And these practices are designed to improve post-school outcomes for students with disabilities. And that might be employment or post-secondary education and living independently. So the results of this research has been referred to as Know What, and often uses advanced methods done by research experts. And at the same time, there has been a growth of less formal know-how research, often done within the context of ongoing work in the field. And it uses informal and formal methods of assessments that are typically student-focused in order to substantiate if a practice is working and it's giving out the expected or intended outcomes for that student and that student population. It's important to remember that we want to avoid the use of unestablished practices that are created through speculation and opinion, which is our bottom left corner here in our chart. Really, the combination of the most relevant and impactful aspects of this know-how and know-what research has resulted in what we call use-based approaches. And this is where action research comes in. So we see here in our chart, we have our quadrant up in the top left corner. So this is our scientific research that I was talking about first, where we're systematically generating reliable and rigorous evidence-based practices. This is done with heavy advanced research methods. We have those unestablished practices that are based on speculation. We have our know-how, and that idea there is to generate and improve our practices within real-world context, but it's missing some of those aspects of research and of inquiry that we know work so well from some of the more rigorous research that happens in the field. And then we have action research that acknowledges that really rigorous advanced research just doesn't make sense for our daily work, but there are things we can take and learn from it and adapt them and modify them to make them practical. So when we do this, we merge our know-how, which is what we know about just from our practice and our experience and being experts in the field, with know what. So that's that literature and that expertise on evidence-based practices, what the literature tells us we know works. And also what the literature tells us we know works in terms of collecting information about our practices. So it's not just what practices work, but also what tools work, what methods work to help us collect this information about what we're doing, what works, what doesn't work, and what we can do better to help our students. So what is action research in secondary transition? Well, first and foremost, it's all about practitioners being the researchers. In doing so, you draw upon your professional knowledge and experiences to identify a problem in practice. So there are many potential problems in practice depending on what your role is and where you work, the population that you serve. Just an example of this is Perhaps a problem in practice is students are not gaining the soft skills they need to succeed in their work placements, or maybe families are disengaged from the transition planning process. The emphasis of action research is to gather data that helps you understand what practices are occurring, how those practices are implemented, and the factors influencing their implementation and overall effectiveness. The goal is to gather enough data to design specific changes to current practices and programs that will improve the problem in practice. So action research does not stop at identifying what practices and how practices should be changed. It actually requires these changes to be made and data to be collected on how they happen as well as their outcomes. So it's not just about what could change, you're also collecting information about what that change looks like when you implement it and what the outcomes of those changes are. The last and most important part of action research that we're going to talk a lot more about today, but also throughout this entire semester, is that it's a cycle. So, in thinking about action research and secondary transition as a cycle, our first step in this cycle is to identify the problem in practice. So, as we just mentioned, we'll draw upon our professional experiences, but we'll also speak with colleagues about what challenges the team, department, school, agency, organization, whatever it may be where you're working, is currently experiencing when it comes to providing effective transition services for young people with disabilities. So in action research, student performance is a symptom of a problem in practice. It is not the problem. The problem is whatever the practice is being done and how they could be more effective, right? So if they're not working, that is the problem in practice. Student performance, whether it be high or low, is a symptom of our practices and what we do. So we're not collecting information to understand student performance in action research. We're collecting information on what we do so we can understand what we can do better. The second step of this cycle in action research is if we have a general idea of what our problem in practice is, that's still really a surface level. There's that big iceberg underneath that we still haven't gotten a good view at. So what we need to do is build out a complete profile of this problem in practice. And it's really not possible for one or a few people on your team, in your organization, or wherever you work to have a full picture without knowing about the problem in practice from everyone who's involved. So anyone who's implementing practices that contribute to the problem in practice, or is influenced or has some type of relationship to the factors that might be influencing the problem in practice, you need to have their input and their knowledge about this problem, about what's happening, what's working, what's not working, what's affecting what's not working. So you really need to have that village of transition professionals who's engaged and has a stake in this problem in practice to share what they know about it. And our third step was just really more of a cycle rather than steps in themselves, is that we develop changes to current practices based upon this profile that we have about the problem in practice. And then we continuously collect data on how often and effective these changes are being implemented and how different factors are implementing them. But you'll notice here that we have that arrow going back because this is an ongoing fluid process, and it's more likely than not that as you implement these changes that you'll have to develop modifications to those original changes you just made and implement those and collect data. So it's this cyclical motion of making changes, implementing them, seeing if they work, and modifying them further. And this is really where action research becomes a whole lot like providing instruction and teaching our students. So let's take a look at an example of a problem in practice and how we might use action research to understand it better. So imagine that we have students in work placements and they're experiencing challenges with soft skills. So maybe they're having challenges with workplace conflict negotiation or setting boundaries, professional boundaries, or communicating their needs and wants. Maybe they're having some challenges with giving and receiving feedback and constructive criticism. So these are all soft skills that the students may be using in a workplace. So at the same time that students are having these challenges, as practitioners, maybe we have a teacher and job coaches and site supervisors who are providing students in these work placements with a myriad of different practices. The practices are being implemented in different ways. Some stakeholders are using one, some stakeholders are using another, and even if these are in the same one, they're likely different. And then the factors that are influencing each stakeholder as they implement these will likely be different. So there's a lot that goes into understanding why students are having these challenges in using soft skills in the work placements. So what we want to do when we're using action research and the action research cycle is we first acknowledge that there's these internal and external factors that are going to be affecting our current practices. And then we'll use a data tool to unpack what those factors are. So which are directly and indirectly impacting how practitioners are implementing these practices in this case example here for supporting our students in building their soft skills. There are so many different factors, particularly in secondary transition, where we're working between schools, agencies, community partners, young people and families, that might be influencing our practices. Just some that may be more likely than others are the degree to which the activity that is being implemented can be adapted and tailored or refined to meet the needs of these different students and sites. So maybe the school or program or agency or organization is saying we're all going to do this particular practice. But that's fine, but the sites and students are also different, right? So that could be a factor. Ease of access to information and knowledge about how to implement these practices and how to incorporate them into the work we're already doing is a factor. The level of resources dedicated to implementing new practices or having access to training, education, space, time, all of these things can influence our practices and our problem practice. We also have other factors like stakeholder perceptions and school or organizational or agency policies. We could have current or previous partnerships that may be playing a particular role in this problem and practice, and also the commitment, involvement, and accountability of our leaders, supervisors, and managers who oversee the practices that we implement. So this is just some of many factors that could be affecting the implementation of our practices and by default, our problem and practice with our students having challenges, in this example, with their soft skills. So while this is particular to this case example, this holds true for any problem and practice, that you're implementing certain practices and you're seeing an outcome that is not what the team expected, and there are these internal and external factors that are impacting your current practices, which are then impacting why you're not seeing the outcomes with your students or the population you serve that you expected to see. But with action research, what we can do is, like I said before, use data tools. We're often creating them, which is something we'll learn how to do this semester, to collect information about these factors and how they influence our work. But we're also going to be collecting information about that current practices in a more detailed and rigorous way. So not just the factors and what influences what we do, but we really want to know exactly what everyone's doing too. Because if we don't know specifically about what evidence-based practices are currently being implemented in terms of who's doing them, what's happening and when, where they're happening, and specifically the steps that are being taken when they're implemented, then if we know about the internal and external factors, we can't do anything with that information, right? So if we know that these factors are influencing our work in some way, if we don't know really specifically about what practices are being done and how, then we can't actually change them to work around some of these factors and overcome some of these internal and external factors and change some ways that we do things to make sure that they don't influence us. And then by doing that, we'll be able to see the outcomes in the populations we serve that we want to see, that they want to see, so they can reach their goals and build the skills and knowledge and achieve what they want to achieve, because that's really what it's all about. So just to wrap this up here, we end up getting into this action research cycle where if we know what we're doing and we know the factors that are influencing what we do, then we develop and implement these changes that account for those factors, and they understand who's doing what, when, and how, and what the students' strengths, challenges, and needs are, of course. We collect information ongoing about how these changes we made to our practices are influencing this problem in practice. So our students, in this example, gaining soft skills that they didn't previously have, but it holds true for any problem in practice, whether you're looking to engage families or collaborate as a team better. Maybe you're trying to build in a new part of your curriculum to focus on some aspect of transition skills. Whatever that problem in practice is, it holds true that you're going to want to know if those changes you made are doing something, right? So in order to do that, you both have to collect information about how those changes are being implemented and continue to monitor student progress or the progress of young people or young adults that you work with. Taking a step back and just thinking about this as an entire cycle and the steps within that cycle, we're going to start off with identifying the problem in practice. We're going to transform that problem into an actionable research question. Once we have this research question, though, we need to say, okay, so which stakeholders know information about this problem? So if my actionable research question is perhaps what can be done to improve family engagement in the transition planning process? This is something we likely all have challenges with, right? So that's our problem in practice, and that's our research question. We want to understand the factors that contribute to why what we're currently doing isn't helping families engage in the transition planning process as much as they could and they should. So the next thing is to say, all right, so who on the team, who in our school, our district, organization, who has information about this problem in practice that they can share with us to help us understand? And going back to our previous conversation here, we need to build that profile out of the problem in practice. So we can think of these as our sample we're going to collect data from. Then, of course, if we know who we're going to collect data from, we need to create our tool. So one thing that's pretty unique to action research is that because each action research problem is unique to where you work and the population and team you work with, you're going to need to make your own tool to collect this information. So this is all about creating that data tool, and we will get into this in detail this semester. By the end of this semester, you will have created your own evaluation tool, collected data with it, and use that tool, analyze the results. So we'll get into that later on in this semester, but just know that action research really requires practitioners to create their own tools to collect data on the problem in practice. And this supplements some of those tools we're already using on student progress, but remember, we're not really interested in what students are doing, we're interested in what we're doing. And we want to do it rigorously, so we're not going to be doing things like reflecting and having conversations about our practices. We're going to create rigorous tools to help us collect that information. And of course, once we've got the information, we've got to analyze the results, right? And really different than other types of research is rather than analyzing the results and saying, this is what happens, we say, now we know exactly what we need to do to change our practices. So we take that information we found, that we collected from those stakeholders who know about the problem in practice, and we make data-driven recommendations about who, what, when, where, and how will change our practices to better support the population that we work with. The idea is that we're changing those practices so we can improve our problem in practice, right? And of course, if we're thinking about ways that we're going to be changing our practice, we're not just going to plan to do it, we'll actually implement them. And while we implement them, just as we saw in the example we just talked about, we're going to evaluate how we're changing them. So we said we were going to change practices. What does that look like now? Is everyone doing it the same way? We call that fidelity. So is the way that these modifications to our practices, are they being implemented in the same way by all the different practitioners on our team? Maybe it's classroom, schools, organization, agencies, whatever it is. And then, of course, we want to know that, is that having an impact, right? Is whatever that problem, the symptom of the problem in practice, has it reduced? Whatever that was in our previous example, we were talking about soft skills and challenges with them that students might have. Are students gaining their soft skills? Are families becoming more engaged? Is your school or district becoming more engaged and collaborating in a meaningful way with vocational rehabilitation, and now your pre-employment transition services are more effective, and you know that because students are gaining employment skills and getting hired, right? And gaining career awareness. Whatever that problem in practice is, you want to make sure that you're collecting information both on how those changes are being implemented and the outcomes of those changes. So what makes a site good for action research? Well, a site can be an entire school, classroom or classrooms, a school program. It could be part of an agency or multiple parts of an agency, programs within one. It could be a team, a division, a department. Your site might be with an organization, like a nonprofit or a provider or a community organization. Your site could be a transition coordinating council, a local task force. There are so many different hands that go into that transition and planning and supporting young people as they prepare to have successful lives after high school, that there are so many different ways when it comes to action research and transition, and so many places that you could have a site at. So these are just some examples. And I encourage you to choose a site that you currently work at. You can choose another site if you can't obtain permission from your site, or if you have a really strong interest and a direct connection and easy access to another site that kind of aligns with an area of interest in transition that you have that you wouldn't be able to investigate at your current site. So this is an alternative, but I strongly, strongly recommend that all students this semester, as we've done in previous semesters, focus on a problem and practice at the site you currently work at, wherever that is, working with young people with disabilities. So sites can be many, many different types of organizations and schools like we talked about, but they have to have a group of stakeholders who are currently working with young people with disabilities as they prepare for adult life. This can be from middle school through high school and way after graduation. But you have to be at a site working with young people with disabilities and their families. The site needs to have a supervisor who's invested in supporting your action research this semester, and ideally a staff climate that prioritizes continually improving transition practices, programs, and supports. So if your site, organization, agency, wherever you work, is resistant to collecting information about what they're doing in order to improve practices, then that could be a challenge for you trying to implement an action research study. And we'll have to talk about that if that's the case. And there's no limit on the number of stakeholders who can participate in your study. But the most important thing to remember is that your sample needs to represent the range of stakeholders working at the site. So you can definitely collect data from family members as well. But ideally, you're collecting information from stakeholders about whatever practices are happening right now, right? We're trying to build a profile of the problem in practice. In previous semesters, there have been cases where students were working in organizations where there were a lot of families involved as volunteers, providing some type of support or aspect of transition programming as volunteers. If that's the case, then your families are stakeholders in the problem in practice. If they're providing some aspect, they have some stake in how practices and programs are being provided, then they should also be included in data collection. But 99% of the time, you're going to be collecting information about the problem in practice from the stakeholders and colleagues that you work with. For this semester, you won't be able to collect information from students. So the agreement that we have for this class to happen, for you to be able to design and implement your own research in this class, is that we do not collect information from students because that requires clearance from GW's Institutional Review Board. And it also requires a school board to vote on that data collection. So those are things that will delay you significantly in meeting your deadlines for the semester to get the grades for your assignments. But most importantly, it's not about grades, it's about really getting to design and implement an action research study that is as meaningful as possible to you, that you and your site really get something out of this semester, that you leave this class having the ability to implement significant change where you work, to become a leader where you work, and to drive the process of understanding the problems in practice that are there and developing recommendations and implementing those recommendations to improve practices. So that's what it's really about, and getting wrapped up in clearances from GW or a school board really takes away a lot of the time that you'll need in order to really immerse yourself this semester in your action research, and that's really what this is all about. So that's a long-winded way of saying that we will not be collecting data from students, any of your students, this semester. And just some housekeeping. We need to secure your site, so you need to have a site agreement form signed and returned before you can begin your research this semester. So this form is under Blackboard, and it's really simple, and it just includes the following information: your site supervisor name, title, and their signature of approval for your study, the site name and full address, and your signature. Also on this document, I've gone ahead and written up an explanation of the things that you'll do in your action research study. So you can use this to explain to your supervisor about what you're going to be doing for this class. And I am more than happy to speak to any supervisors that you work with, coordinators, or school administrators, any administrators, about your action research this semester.